Good afternoon. My name is Sandy Satterwhite, and I am with Henrico County Recreation and Parks History Section. And part of our job is to learn about Henrico history, to find out what impacted citizens over the centuries. And this program means a lot to me. I did it a year or so ago, and the research was fascinating with what I learned. So thank you so much for joining us and for your patience. The past can appear so far away. By reading accounts from history, they can almost seem as a dream or a storyline from a movie. But when we can make human connections to the past, that's when history becomes reality. Many touchstones from the past have disappeared, sadly. But if we look, we can see the evidence of important moments in history that still exist around us. This house that you see has a lot to do with today's program, and it's actually what sparked me to create this program. It's located at the intersection of Mountain Road and Scotchtown Road in Henrico County, which is Route 33, and Scotchtown Road is Route 671. They're very close. These are where the counties butt up against each other, and Henrico County borders very close to where this house stands. Once upon a time in the early 1920s, a little boy grew up not far at all from this house. He and his father in the summer months regularly traveled Mountain Road in a wagon pulled by a team of mules. It was loaded with tobacco and farm produce they had raised to sell at the market in Richmond. The little boy always remembered when he asked his father who lived in the big house. And his father whispered, "The people who helped the slaves escape." All right. How did the enslavement of human beings start in Virginia? Somewhere still submerged in the dark waters of a creek off the Chesapeake Bay, sitting in the silt and the mud, is the rotting remains of a 17th century pirate ship. In the year 1619, this once strong ship sailed the Atlantic with its belly filled with human cargo. Its original mission on the high seas was an illegal voyage to the West Indies to join with another pirate ship. The two ships encountered a wicked storm in the Gulf of Mexico that blew them off their planned course. Soon in calmer waters, the pirate ship encountered a Spanish frigate, described later as an Angola ship. Below the deck of that ship, chained and packed inside, were 300 Bantu prisoners bound for a lifetime of bondage in the silver mines in Mexico. The pirates attacked the slave ship and carried off 60 of the African prisoners and headed to the Virginia colony. These first African prisoners arrived at Point Comfort on the southern tip of the Virginia Peninsula late in August of 1619. And the dragon seeds of slavery would take root and grow. In 19th century Virginia, outside travelers, when they traveled to Virginia, were appalled by what they saw of the system of slavery that was practiced here. In 1842, the English novelist Charles Dickens, on a visit to the capital city of Richmond, wrote in depth about what he saw of the gloom and dejection and the ruin and decay that he attributed to this horrible institution of slavery. He observed that the lavish hotels in downtown Richmond held a dual purpose: comfortable sleeping quarters on the upper floors for wealthy guests, and in the basement were the auction blocks where men, women, and children were bartered for. Dickens also saw the slave pens that were situated not far at all from the governor's executive mansion, where individuals were housed till they could be sold. Southern slaveholders asserted that they treated their workers with kindness, and then that their workforce was always loyal to them and grateful for every mouth of food they were given. They believed that lie. Underneath the white population of Virginia, most of them did not really believe this propaganda, and they lived in a constant state of fear of a slave uprising. Through a series of very harsh slave codes, white Virginians prohibited the enslaved from learning to read, restricted their movements, prevented them from meeting in groups unless a white person was present, and publicly punished those who attempted to escape slavery. In 1807 Act of the U.S. Congress abolished the international slave trade, but the domestic trade continued to flourish for 56 more years. Richmond became the largest slaveholding trading center in the Upper South, and in the 19th century, the buying and selling of human beings was Virginia's largest industry. In 1850, Democratic Senator James M. Mason of Virginia drafted the Fugitive Slave Act, which penalized officials who did not arrest someone escaping from enslavement and made them liable for a fine of $1,000, which is roughly equivalent today to $38,000. Law enforcement officials everywhere were required to arrest anyone suspected of escaping enslavement on as little as a claimant's sworn testimony of ownership. They would believe it. You could lie. Didn't matter. As long as you claimed it, it was fact. One Saturday morning in Richmond in the late 1850s, a young German immigrant named Philip Whitlock had just begun to work in an area known as Butchertown in Richmond's Shockoe Bottom district. He wrote years later how one morning as he was walking down the sidewalk, I heard some loud talking inside a store. Curious, he looked in a window and saw a crowd of men standing around in a large room. One man was standing up on an elevated platform, crying loudly, "Going, going, gone." At first, not understanding what he was seeing, he then saw something that would live in his memory for the rest of his life. Whitlock described in his 1908 memoir how he noticed a door to the rear of the building, and he saw a white man lead out a black woman and two children. The children looked to be about 2 to 5 years old. After being placed on the elevated platform, Whitlock watched as the woman and the two small children stood there silently, the youngest one sucking its thumb. The auctioneer called out, "How much am I offered for this woman?" 23 years old and two children, one a boy and one a girl. Whitlock wrote, I heard $1,200 called out. And so it went on until the family was sold for $1,359. Next, he witnessed the sale of a great big man who went for $2,300. The man was wearing rolled up sleeves and rolled up trousers. Some of the buyers examined him like they were buying a horse, examining his back for whipping scars and feeling his legs and arms for any signs of weakness. Whitlock was deeply troubled by what he'd witnessed and said, I left after that and never had any desire to go there again. Although it was novel for me, still my feeling of humanity was such that I did not approve of that traffic, although there were a good many people who were there then looked upon as respectable and in good standing that engaged in that business. The area where Whitlock had witnessed the slave auction was a section of Richmond that is now 15th Street between 14th and 18th Street. It was once home to as many as 69 or more slave dealers and auction houses, where tens of millions of dollars changed hands for human beings before and during the Civil War. To find freedom, many sought to escape and run away. To the north, the Underground Railroad began, which were numerous loosely organized networks all across the South that assisted individuals to escape to freedom in the north and then on to Canada. The individuals were known as station masters or conductors, and they risked their lives and the journey. Not all Virginians supported the system of enslaving human beings. And yes, the Underground Railroad was a The Religious Society of Friends first began in 17th century England, beginning in the American colonies by the 1750s. Reformers within the Society of Friends mainly were in Philadelphia. They began arguing that slavery was contrary to the religious equality of all persons, which was and still is a foundational concept of the Quaker doctrine. The Virginia Society for Promoting the Abolition of Slavery and the Relief of Free Negroes and Others Unlawfully Held in Bondage was a Richmond-based anti-slavery organization, and they were active from 1790 to 1804. They were founded by Robert Pleasants, a wealthy Quaker slaveholder who turned abolitionist, and he lived in Henrico County. In the area of Hanover County that is known even to this day as Cedar Creek, there had long been a congregation of Quakers. Dolly Payne, the future First Dolly Madison, First Lady of the United States, she and her family were very active in the Cedar Creek Meeting House in Hanover. The Reverend Nathaniel Chapman Crenshaw and his family, whom we'll talk about more in just a minute, was also a member of the Cedar Creek Quaker community. This next individual is one of my favorite heroes in history. And I found that working at Meadow Farm, when I do children's programs, children adore hearing the story of Henry Box Brown. The courageous Henry Box Brown. He wrote, "I entered the world a slave in the midst of a country whose most honored writings declared that all men have a right to liberty. If you have never been deprived of your liberty, as I was, you cannot realize the power of that hope of freedom, which was to me indeed an anchor to my soul, both sure and steadfast. Buoyed up by the prospect of freedom, I was willing even to dare death itself." Henry Brown was born into enslavement in a large plantation called the Hermitage in Louisa County in 1815. The Hermitage was the home of the very wealthy Barrett family, and it had been built by John Barrett, who would serve many times as mayor in Richmond. Now, Henry Brown wrote of one of his first memories, and he said, "At an early age, my mother would take me on her knee and pointing to the forest trees adjacent, now being stripped of their thick foliage by autumnal winds, she would say to me, 'My son, as yonder leaves are stripped from off the trees of the forest, so are the children of slaves swept away from them by the hands of cruel tyrants. As an adult, Henry worked in one of Richmond's finest tobacco factories, and he lived in a small rented house in Shockoe Bottom with his wife and children. He and his wife were members of the First Baptist Church in Richmond. Now, the tobacco house was owned by Colonel William Barrett, the son of Box Brown's former enslaver. And Barrett's tobacco factory was on Main Street between 23rd and 24th Streets, and it was one of the largest in Richmond. In the year 1850 alone, it was estimated to have produced over 400,000 pounds of chewing tobacco annually. In 1848, while at work one day, a co-worker rushed up to Brown and told him that he'd seen his wife and children being taken to be sold away. Henry had, for some years, been paying Barrett a monthly stipend not to sell away his wife and children. He rushed boldly up to the elegant home of William Barrett, and he banged on the front door, yelling and questioning through the closed door why his children and his wife were being taken away. The door remained closed. Finally, he repeatedly banged, repeatedly demanding to see Mr. Barrett. The door was finally opened by an enslaved man who said, "Mr. Barrett will not see you." Henry turned and rushed towards the dock, frantically looking for his family. Barrett's Tobacco, the building was not far from the harbor there on the James River. And soon he saw, in the middle of the street, his wife Nancy. She was manacled in a large group of other enslaved individuals. It was known as a coffle, a slave coffle. His children were restrained in a wagon following behind the coffle. All were being taken to the docks near the 14th Street Bridge to be loaded onto a boat to be sold to labor in the cotton fields of the Deep South. Anytime an enslaved person was sold south, their life expectancy would cut almost in half. It really was a death sentence to be sold south. Henry found his family, but there was nothing he could do. He whispered goodbyes, he touched the faces of his children, and promised that they would meet again. He resolved at that moment to escape from slavery and to find his family. And to do this, he would enlist the aid of a free man named James C. Brown to help him escape from Richmond. The plan they devised was that Henry would be secreted inside a wooden box that was addressed to a well-known Quaker in Philadelphia, who was also a member of the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society. On March 29, 1849, with the help of Smith, Henry was sealed into a wooden crate bound for Philadelphia. And he described this later in his memoir. "I laid down in my darkened home of 3 feet by 2 feet, and like one about to be guillotined, resigned myself to my fate." The journey would nearly kill him. For 27 grueling hours long, Henry stayed quietly inside the box. It was first hauled by wagon, then to be placed on a train on the railroad. Then the next leg of his journey, he was placed into a steamboat, and it was frightening the entire way. One of his accounts say that when he's on the steamboat, the box is there, and it had been painted on the side of the box, "This end up." And if you've ever shipped a package, few people pay attention to that instruction. So Henry spent maybe 3/4 of his journey upside down. So the box, Henry inside of it, upside down, Two sailors come and they sit on top of his box. He writes about this later. And they start banging on it. Wonder what's inside here. The fear that Henry felt at that moment caused him to faint. He had little air. He only had a small hole, wooden cut in the wooden side of the box. And being upside down for that long, it's understandable that he would faint. But he did come to. And he recounts about the rest of his journey, which was unbelievable. I just don't see how a human could stand it, but he did. And he wrote at that moment when he finally, the box is taken to Pennsylvania. He's almost there. He's brought by wagon. And it's picked up at the station. The men act like it's just any other box. And as they bring it inside, they close the door. There's a group of about 3 or 4 men standing there, and they're listening. They don't hear anything. So they knock on the box. Henry, are you all right? Not a sound. They thought for sure he had died. So they get a crowbar and they wrench off the top, and Henry stands up and says, "Praise be to God. I am alive and I am free." To me, it's one of the best stories in history of the determination of the human soul for what we all were born to deserve, our freedom. That really takes me away. Goodness. Now, he said that he looked when he's coming out of the box. He looked around and he beheld his friends, and they told him, "You're safe. You have done your bravest, your best, and you have arrived safely." And he said, "Praise be to the Most High God. I am a free man. My labor was accomplished. My warfare was ended. And I stood erect before other men as an equal, no longer a crouching slave, forever at the look and the nod of a whimsical and tyrannical slave owner." There would be so much demand to hear this amazing story of Henry Brown. He began traveling on a lecture circuit all across New England, and he saved his money, every bit of money that he could, to try to find his family and purchase their freedom. And he wrote an account, a true account of his journey, and it's entitled "The Narrative of Henry Box Brown." And amazingly, it is available to read for free. It's part of the public domain. So if you type that title up, you can read it. It's very moving and very touching account. In 1850, Henry Brown traveled in a theatrical panorama entitled "Henry Box Brown's Mirror of Slavery." It opened in Boston. For months, hundreds flocked to hear his story and see him reenact his resurrection from a replica of the wooden box. He took it with him, and it had carried him to freedom. It is heartbreaking, but Henry was never able to find his family. He did marry again and had children, but he was never able to rejoin with his original family. William Still, one of the men who was there in Philadelphia that day and helped Henry Brown emerge from his box in 1849, was the man who would become known as the father of the Underground Railroad. In every era, in times of trouble, great men and women are born who fight for what is right, for no other reason than it is right. And William Still was just such an individual. He was born the youngest of 18 children. He was born on October the 7th, 1821, to Charity and Levin Still. Now, before William's birth, his father had been able to purchase his own freedom from his master on the eastern shore of Maryland. Still's mother, Charity, she tried to escape twice from enslavement in Maryland to follow him. The first time, she had 4 of her children with her. They were heartbreakingly recaptured and returned to slavery. Determined to be free, Charity Still escaped yet again. But this time she was only able to take her 2 youngest daughters with her. And this time she was successful. And she was able to meet and join with her husband in New Jersey. Charity Still had made the most heartbreaking choice of her life. Fearing for the vulnerability of her young daughters living in enslavement, she made the painful decision to leave her 2 sons in Maryland. The 2 boys, Levin Jr. and Peter, would be sold from Maryland into Lexington, Kentucky. And as an adult, Levin was sold to Alabama. And years afterward, it was reported that tragically he was killed as the result of a beating he received from his overseer. Now, don't forget Peter. We're going to talk about him in just a moment and find out his amazing story. In the years after escaping to freedom, Charity would give birth to 14 more children. And that last child that she had was a little boy, and he was given the name of William, which is an ancient English name, and it means resolute protector. And William Still most definitely lived up to his name. William's life mission would be to help families torn apart and forcibly separated from those they loved. In 1847, at the age of 26, William Still began working as a clerk for the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society. Each day, individuals would come in and seek aid to help find their family members still held in bondage in the South. 3 years later, on an August day in 1850, William Still opened the door to the Anti-Slavery Society and welcomed in a formerly enslaved man named Peter Freedman, who had been seeking to find his parents and any member of his family that he could find. Freedman began to tell William Still his story and what he remembered of his mother and of his 3 other siblings, and where they had lived in slavery on the eastern shore of Maryland. Freedman mentioned how he wanted to see if there was any way, if he could find out if his mother was still alive. As William listened and took notes, he soon realized that he could fill in many of the details before Peter told him. William looked up at what was nothing less than a miracle and said, "What if I told you I'm your brother?" Peter was looking at his own youngest brother, born long after Peter had been left behind by his family. The very next day, Peter was able to be rejoined with his 80-year-old mother. During William Still's lifetime, he helped as many as 800 escape to freedom. Now, we are going to talk about something that isn't really mentioned very much in history, and I find this fascinating, and I hope you will too. It's the seafaring men of the Underground Railroad. Interestingly, there is a group of agents in the Underground Railroad, hardly remembered. They were the captains of steamers and schooners who smuggled those who were held in bondage up to safety in the North. Sadly, often disreputable sea captains often demanded money from the runaways, and then once paid, when faced with the threat of an inspection of their ship, some captains didn't hesitate to toss overboard the boxes containing their human cargo. William Still, in his book, The Underground Railroad, A Record of Facts, identified 6 primary ships that faithfully assisted in the mission to take former slaves to freedom. And at the top of the list was a ship named the City of Richmond that aided Virginia runaways. If any sea captain was caught with human contraband, they could be fined or jailed, and their ships, which were their livelihoods, could be confiscated and sold. Of the 175 agent facilitators of the Underground Railroad, a captain from Virginia stands out as the one that still worked with the most. His name was Captain Alfred Fountain, and his ship was called the City of Richmond, and it sailed primarily out of the ports of Richmond and Norfolk. And he conducted a regular packet route service to New York City. William Still said he considered Fountain a true friend of the slave and one of the most daring and heroic captains ever connected to the Underground Railroad. Fountain had an intimidating physical appearance, and he made a formidable challenge to any slave hunter who tried to capture the runaways. Still went on to say that Fountain had the faith of a martyr, and he would deliberately enter the enemy's domain with his bowie knives and revolvers for humanity's sake. Captain Fountain was more than willing to sacrifice his life for the cause, and he had no fear of death or however it may come. His tenacity was tested on several occasions, but none more than in November of 1855, when the mayor himself of Norfolk and his police officers boarded the ship, the City of Richmond. They demanded to search the hull of the ship for any potential runaways who could be on board. Hidden within that hold was 21 freedom seekers, 16 men and 5 women. The mayor was intent on inspecting the ship himself. The police with him were equipped with long pikes and clubs and axes to enforce their search. Captain Fountain was as wily as a fox. When the police came on board with their weapons, and on hearing that his ship was to be seized for harboring runaways, Fountain, without hesitation, confidently demanded, "All right, now, if you want to search, give me the axe, and I'll point to the spot where you want to have open. And I'll open it very quickly." Without waiting for a reply, Fountain picked up an axe and began hacking on the wooden deck of his ship. With such ferocity, it convinced the mayor the ship's got to be empty and not hiding any slaves. Captain wouldn't ruin his own ship to help and aid their service. The mayor and his men soon left. They were rather eager to get away from the potential madman. As the ship calmly floated away from the dock, Fountain coolly saluted and waved to the mayor on the dock as he sailed to Philadelphia with his secret and precious cargo safely inside. I'm sure you will know this next person. Her name that she was given was Araminta, but we know her as Harriet Ross Tubman. She was one of the conductors of the Underground Railroad. Harriet Tubman. Oh, let me get my. Oh, there's Fountain. Okay, there she is. There she is. What a beautiful person. She is one of the best known conductors of the Underground Railroad, and she well deserves all the accolades that she's gotten over the years. Her list of accomplishments is astounding. She herself was a freedom seeker. She was a military commander. She was a nurse. She was a conductor for the Underground Railroad and a very valuable spy. She was born Araminta Ross in 1822 in Dorchester County, Maryland, to Ben Ross and Harriet Green. Her ancestry was from the culturally significant Ashanti tribe in Ghana, West Africa. One of 9 children, Tubman was nicknamed Minty by her mother. Over the years, she endured an extremely harsh life, including the anguish of seeing several of her sisters sold away, never to see them again. During her enslavement, she suffered numerous beatings and injury. It was noted how, at the time, that she would often go into a catatonic like state. She suffered seizures, and she would recount later how she'd seen visions that encouraged her to go forward and to be free. In 1849, after the death of her enslaver, Edward Broadus, she learned she was going to be sold and forcibly separated from her remaining family. Years later, she described this moment in her life. And she said there was one of 2 things I had a right to: liberty or death. If I could not have one, I will have the other. And sometime in the fall of 1849, Harriet Tubman escaped. And to let her friends and family know that she was going to freedom, she sang softly to them, "I'll meet you in the morning. I'm bound for the promised land." She traveled at night and hid by day. Her only guide was the North Star high in the night sky. Traveling along the northeast coast, along the Choptank River, through Delaware into Pennsylvania. It was a journey of nearly 90 miles. Years later, Harriet recalled, "I looked at my hands to see if I was the same person now that I was free. There was such a glory over everything, and I felt like I was in heaven." Her joy at being free was short-lived, as it sunk into her how her family remained trapped in enslavement. She knew unless she tried to liberate them, she would never see them again. Harriet Tubman settled in the bustling city of Philadelphia and worked as a cook, a laundress, and maid to support herself and to save money for her family, constantly thinking and planning how to rescue them. In December of 1854, she walked up to 109 North 6th Street to the Philadelphia Anti-Slavery Society. And there she met the Underground Railroad conductor William Still. In 1850, Congress had passed the Fugitive Slave Act, making it illegal to assist an enslaved person to escape. Harriet eagerly joined the Underground Railroad as a conductor to lead and show the way for other freedom seekers to the North and to safety. Knowing firsthand the trauma and pain of being sold away from her family, she bravely returned to the South approximately 13 times to successfully lead her family members and many others to freedom. Tubman worked during the winter months, and she departed with freedom seekers on a Saturday night. That was specifically chosen to be the night, because enslavers would not be able to publish the runaway notices in newspapers until the following Monday. Gave them a little bit more time to get farther away. In May 1862, Tubman traveled to South Carolina, where she served as a nurse treating soldiers and contrabands. Contraband was a military term commonly used in the Civil War to describe the new status of those who had successfully escaped enslavement. Tubman also daringly assisted Major General David Hunter, U.S. commander of the South Carolina Sea Islands, And on the night of June the 2nd, 1863, Harriet Tubman made U.S. military history by becoming the first woman commander of a military operation. With knowledge she had obtained through her work as a scout throughout the South, Tubman led members of the 2nd South Carolina Infantry Volunteers of African ancestry on a military raid. There were numerous, very wealthy rice plantations, and in their raid, free more than 750 enslaved people. A U.S. Sanitary Commission agency representative met and persuaded Tubman to travel with them to Virginia in order to work in some of the Union hospitals along the James River. There was a great need for someone willing to work at the segregated military hospital at Fort Monroe in Hampton Roads. Tubman agreed to serve, and she was placed at Fort Monroe's Colored Hospital to treat wounded and sick African American soldiers and contrabands and aid them in becoming acclimated in living free. In 1869, Tubman married Nelson Davis, who had served with Company G, 8th U.S. Colored Infantry in the Civil War. Davis was 20 years younger than she. In 1874, Harriet and Nelson adopted a baby girl and named her Gertie, and Gertie is standing right there next to her, beautiful young girl. Now, after the war ended, Tubman returned to Auburn, New York, where she opened a home for the aged and infirmed. The home has become a National Historic Landmark. Harriet Tubman died on March 10, 1913, and she was buried with full military honors at Fort Hill Cemetery in Auburn, New York. Harriet Tubman said her most proud achievement was, "I never lost a passenger." For decades before the Civil War, slave markets and pens and jails served as holding cells for those waiting to be sold. During and after the war, freed men and women converted these horrific slave jails into places of public worship, aid for those who were ill and sick and hungry, and for education. Robert Lumpkin's notorious black slave jail in Richmond became the home of a prominent black seminary that is now known as Virginia Union University, a historically black university. The old slave pen was no longer the devil's half acre, but God's half acre, wrote one of the seminary founders. Here's where we began. Let me make sure. Yep, got my slides right. We began our program with this old house in Hanover 160 years ago. It had become a beacon of hope and a place of refuge for those stealing themselves away to freedom. The Reverend Nathaniel Crenshaw of Shrubbery Hill is today credited for helping more than 300 enslaved people to escape to freedom through Virginia's Underground Railroad. The little boy, if you remember, that we talked about at the beginning, who was so fascinated by the house that served as a station to freedom. When he grew up, he told others about the Underground Railroad and made them promise not to forget. It's now our turn to remember, to learn, and to talk to others about the history that took place in our state. And it's often right on our own doorstep. It's incumbent on every single one of us to honor the lives that struggled under human bondage and to remember the quiet bravery of those who risked their lives to assist and help them to travel to freedom. Thank you for listening. Thank you for, I hope, being interested to learn more about this topic. And I have a suggested reading list. And I know I can't give it to you now, but if you call Meadow Farm Museum, the Parsons Center, we'll be happy to email you a copy of the books that this program was created around. I want to thank you very much. I hope I will see you again virtually someday soon. But if not, please come to Meadow Farm. We're going to be having a spooky history program on the history of witchcraft and the Salem witches. Thank you so much for joining us, and I hope someday we'll meet in person. Thank you.